Obrigado, Carlos. Thank you for your kind words. Let me also say, boa tarde a todos. As you can probably tell, I've just exhausted my knowledge of Portuguese. So I think I'll stick with English from here on in. Ladies and gentlemen, I feel privileged to have this opportunity to share some ideas with you. The feeling of privilege is due to the great respect I have for the Francisco Manuel dos Santos Foundation as it progresses through its second decade. That respect is rooted in the Foundation's deep and abiding interest in the subjects of fundamental importance, both here in Portugal and beyond. It's rooted in the Foundation's commitment to rigorous evidence-based policy, and it's rooted in the Foundation's belief, that's what I was looking for, thank you. It's rooted in the Foundation's belief in democratized knowledge as a powerful instrument of social and institutional change. My compliments to the Foundation, to the far-sighted and thoughtful vision of its founders, and to the dedication and professionalism of its leadership. My compliments also on the panel discussion that just concluded. It was terrific, and it laid a very solid foundation, really a perfect foundation for this session, in which we're going to delve into the what, the so what, and the now what of global demographic change. The what refers to salient facts about the size, growth, and structure of various populations. The so what refers to the economic significance of those facts, with emphasis on the latest thinking about the links between demographic trends and patterns and economic behavior and performance. And the now what refers to public and private policies that are technically and economically sound, and in terms of being ways to cope with the changes in store. As advertised, I'll spend most of my time covering those items at a global level, although I'll also offer some thoughts on the evolving demographic scene here in Portugal. Before I launch into the main content, I want to remind everyone, in the spirit of full disclosure, that I'm an economist, and that economics is the lens I plan to use to look at these issues. Now, being an economist means three things. First, it makes me a member of a tribe that's often said to know too much for its own good and not enough for anyone else's. Second, it means that unlike my ethicist colleagues who regard virtue as its own reward, I was taught to regard reward as its own virtue. And third, it means that I've been trained to take matters that are perfectly obvious and make them utterly incomprehensible. But this afternoon, I'm going to try to break with that long-standing tradition among my peers and take a few exceedingly complex realities and make them appear a bit more obvious. And let me just share at the outset that I have three main messages to convey. The first is that demography matters. It matters with respect to the pace, the process, and the contours of economic growth and national development. And the second main message is not much more complicated. It's that demography matters a lot. It's exceedingly difficult to find another set of factors that pose more challenges or have a greater influence on macroeconomic performance and economic development than does demographics. And my third message is that policy matters too. It matters in the sense that policymakers have many options for shaping both demographic trajectories and their implications for economic well-being. Let me also say at the outset that nearly all of the demographic issues we'll cover today, or that I'll cover this afternoon, have relevance to Portugal, as recent news headlines make abundantly clear, whether it's low fertility, population decline, population aging, the epidemic of non-communicable diseases, international migration, or the cross-border impacts of policy and institutional changes, such as last month's Brexit. We're meeting today during what is an extremely exciting time for demographers. It's exciting because the world is in the midst of a great demographic upheaval. There are many more indicators of that upheaval than we have time to cover, so I'm going to basically take some liberties here and focus on what I consider to be the top group. And I'll also comment on their relevance to our economic well-being and prospects. The first indicator I'd like to cover has to do with population size and growth. It took over 99% of human history until roughly the year 1800, as Pedro mentioned during the panel, to reach a global population of 1 billion people. But since 1960, we've added successive billions every 1 to 2 decades, reaching 6 billion around the year 2000, with projections that will reach 10 billion before 2060. Rapid population growth poses a number of serious challenges related to fulfilling the basic needs of ever larger numbers of people, absorbing them into productive employment, and also, and extremely important today, environmental protection. And I would note in that connection, in passing, that the environmental challenges are magnified by the growing concentration of people in dense urban settlements. That increased from 30% of world population in 1950 to 56% today, to a projected 68% by the year 2050. Now, I've plotted some numbers for you here. This is a plot. The blue line on this plot basically shows rates of world population growth from 1950 to today. That's the line, and projected to the year 2050. And the data come from the UN Population Division, which is the main archiver, assembler, and disseminator of world population information. Now, as you can see from this chart, and the fact that that blue line slopes down, the rate of world population growth has been slowing. The annual growth rate is currently half the 2% rate that prevailed in the late 1960s, and it's expected to halve again by the year 2050. This decline was not unexpected by demographers. We all know, all demographers know, that our 2% peak rate of growth cannot be sustained in perpetuity. The mathematics here is absolutely crystal clear. As some of you may know, if sustained for 35 years, a 2% rate of growth would lead to a doubling of population. What I imagine fewer of you know is that if sustained for 700 years, a 2% rate of growth would lead population to increase by a factor of 1 million. If sustained for 1,200 years, a 2% rate of growth would lead the people occupying our planet to outweigh the planet itself. And if sustained for 6,000 years, the mass of human flesh would be expanding outward from the earth at the speed of light. Declines in the rate of population growth have diffused the once widespread fears of a global population explosion. Essentially, those global concerns have been replaced by concerns over rapid population growth in particular country and regional settings, especially Sub-Saharan Africa. The fact is that virtually all population growth projected in the coming decades will take place in today's low and middle income countries. This is itself a huge concern, since these countries tend to be politically, socially, economically, and ecologically less robust than their high income counterparts. And let me share 3 other flash facts with you. First, between now and the year 2050, population growth is projected to be negative in 61 countries that are currently home to 29% of the world's population. Second, by 2050, Nigeria is projected to overtake the United States and become the world's 3rd most populous nation. And third, before the end of this decade, India will surpass China and move into the top spot with respect to national population. The second indicator I'd like to cover of demographic upheaval has to do with human longevity. For most of human history, the average person lived about 30 years. But since 1950, global life expectancy increased by almost that much, from 46 years in 1950 to 73 years today, and it's projected to continue its upward trend. All demographers agree that life expectancy will continue to increase. The only debate is whether it will increase rapidly at about 2.5 years per decade, modestly at 1.5 years per decade, or more slowly at about a half year per decade, with a topping off somewhere in the mid-80s or perhaps 90. And the supercharged optimists, when it comes to life expectancy, basically believe that life expectancy will surpass 100, I think it was mentioned on the panel, in some countries in the second half of this century. To really bring the phenomenal nature of this growing longevity trend to life, I would point out simply its implication that during the course of this 1-hour session that we have together, your life expectancy is projected to increase 23 minutes. So good news for all of us. Longevity gains are a colossal human achievement. They're reflective of improved nutrition, of the development and diffusion of modern medicine and of classic public health innovations related to childhood vaccination, and also of more widespread and consistent access to safe water and sanitation. These advances have led to reductions in morbidity and mortality that are now recognized as a powerful driver of economic progress. They drive economic progress because a healthier workforce tends to be a more productive workforce, because it's also a workforce that spends less on health care, and a workforce that's like a powerful magnet when it comes to attracting direct foreign investment and the technology and trade that accompany direct foreign investment. Over the longer term, economic progress is also driven by healthier kids who tend to stay in school longer, have better records of school attendance every year they're in school, and who learn more every day they spend in school, and grow up fitter, taller, stronger, smarter, earn more, pay more taxes, and so on. The tagline here is healthier means wealthier. The idea that a healthy population is a robust cornerstone of a vibrant and growing economy. This is different from the traditional view that population health is mainly a social indicator that improves after countries get rich. The new view, the healthier means wealthier view, continues to acknowledge health as conferring intrinsic value on us, but also sees health as a form of human capital that has instrumental value in helping us gain income and accumulate wealth. To appreciate the finding, which I would say is maybe one of the most important findings in the field of development economics of the past 20 years, to appreciate that finding, let's conduct a quick thought experiment in which we imagine two countries that are identical in all key dimensions pertinent to economic growth, except that the people in one country are healthier than the people in the other. The new finding suggests that the healthier country will increase its average income faster than the less healthy country. And it also tells us that a 10-year gain in life expectancy translates into as much as 1 additional percentage point of annual growth of income per capita. Now, a 1 percentage point advantage may not sound like much, but in a world economy, and certainly in the Portuguese economy, in which per capita income typically grows at 1, 2, maybe 3% per year, a 1 percentage point boost on top of that is actually a really big deal. And it's an especially big deal because of compound interest, which serves to magnify the effect of that 1% boost when it's maintained over time. And if any of you have any doubts about the importance of compounding and compound interest, please note that Albert Einstein is said to have identified it, and not E equals mc squared, as the most important mathematical discovery of all time. My point here is that we're not talking about incremental bumps to economic growth. Rather, we're talking about transformative economic boosts. That's what health and longevity gains have and can continue to deliver. I would also note here the central importance of health in the alleviation of poverty. If you think about it for a moment, you'll quickly realize that the main asset poor people possess is their labor, and the value of that asset is crucially determined by their health. This explains, to my mind, why health has come to figure so prominently in plans to reduce poverty, which has emerged as the central imperative, really, of the entire global development community. The third indicator of demographic upheaval concerns the fall in fertility rates. In 1950, the average woman in the world, so I'm talking about all women, all countries, the average woman in the world had 5 children over the course of her childbearing years. Today, the average woman has slightly less than 2.5 children. That's another phenomenal shift, reflective of lower levels of desired fertility, the advent of modern contraception, more attention to reproductive health generally, and also the educational progress enjoyed by girls and women. That decline in fertility from 5 to 2.5 has also unburdened hundreds of millions of women from years of child-rearing responsibilities, enabling higher levels of market work and improved standards of living for them and their families. Let me now comment on an important demographic model. It's a model known as the demographic transition. The term demographic transition is what demographers use to signify a temporal change, a change over time from a regime of high mortality and high fertility to low mortality and low fertility. And you see it depicted here on the slide behind me. Now, I've already indicated that between 1950 and 2020, both mortality and fertility have declined. But it turns out that the declines didn't happen exactly at the same time. They were what we call asynchronous. In other words, in most countries, a key feature of the transition is that mortality rates decline before fertility rates. The result, because the difference between fertility and mortality is population growth, the result is a transitional period of population growth, and that was actually an extremely powerful driver of the more than tripling of world population that we've experienced since 1950. I told you, in 1950, we had about 2.5 billion people on the planet. Today, we have about 7.7, 7.8 billion, so that's the tripling that I'm referring to. One recent breakthrough in our understanding of the interplay of demographics and economics has to do with the fact that the rate of population growth is not the only population dynamic that is economically consequential. The age structure of the population is also quite important, and it changes in predictable ways in the course of a demographic transition or in the aftermath of a baby boom. I was trained in economics, and I was trained that the main drivers of economic activity and well-being all have to do with prices and income. But what I've learned over the last 30 years of research is that in addition to prices and income, demographics is also important. Numbers of people, where they're distributed on the planet, how concentrated urban areas or not, or do they live near coastal areas, and also, and very importantly, their age distribution. Now, I just mentioned that the age distribution changes very predictably in the aftermath of a demographic transition or of a baby boom. So just as one example, the US baby boom ran from 1946 to 1964. US baby boomers started to turn 65 in the early years of the last decade. That actually includes three of the most famous baby boomers in the US, President George W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, and President Donald Trump. They were all born in 1946, and they turned 73 this past summer. You see some recent birthday celebrations for all of them. More importantly, as all demographers learn in Demography 101, mortality declines in high mortality populations, populations that are at the start of the demographic transition. Those mortality declines are mainly associated with declines in infant and child mortality. Typically, that's the result of increased access to vaccines, antibiotics, safe water, and sanitation. That actually causes a baby boom, but it's not the usual baby boom that we're used to, in which there are more births. It's a baby boom that's caused by those babies having higher survival rates. The baby boom ends when fertility subsequently declines, which it invariably does as couples realize that fewer births are needed to reach their targets for surviving children, and also as those targets are moderated. Now, baby booms are very consequential economically because lots of children, as I'm sure everyone knows, lots of children require lots of resources for food, clothing, housing, medical care, and schooling. And those resources do not appear out of thin air. They have to be diverted from other uses such as building factories, laying down infrastructure, and investing in research and development. And that diversion of resources tends to slow the process of economic growth as conventionally measured. But then the Iron Law of Demography kicks in, and we're all very painfully aware of that law because it tells us that with the passage of every year, our age goes up by 1. It's important here because it means that the baby boom triggered by the beginning of a demographic transition will invariably reach the working ages within a period of 15 to 25 years. And when that happens, the productive capacity of the economy expands on a per capita basis, and what's called the demographic dividend is in prospect. This demographic dividend is a window of opportunity for rapid growth of income and poverty reduction. And please note, it's connected with fertility decline. Okay, so in the last panel, we heard lots of calls for fertility increase and pro-natalist policies aimed at addressing population decline in Portugal. Please keep in mind that that may actually make things worse in the short run in terms of economic growth because you have to feed, clothe, house, educate all those children, which requires, as I say, resources. Anyway, this dynamic process I'm talking about here of demographic dividend is sometimes analogized to a python that swallowed a pig. where the bulge in the snake marks the progression of the pig through the snake's digestive tract. The window of opportunity opens as the pig makes its way to the prime years for working and saving, and it closes when the pig is fully digested and is excreted out the other end in the form of, I'm sorry to say, an aging population. The demographic transition and associated baby boom were a big part of the explanation of East Asia's economic ascendancy in the past half century. Basically, the precipitous decline of fertility in China, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and Hong Kong allowed those countries to escape the crushing burden of youth dependency and to grow their per capita incomes by over 6% per year for decades. Never before in history had such a large group of countries grown their incomes so rapidly for so long. Interestingly, the World Bank set out to study this phenomenon, hoping to unlock the secrets of East Asia's economic success and to transport those lessons to other parts of the world, like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. They published their analysis in this 1994 book, where they dubbed the success a miracle. Now, that was basically a confession of ignorance on the part of the World Bank, in the sense that the miracle label is something you ascribe to a phenomenon when you actually can explain it, not when you can. In other words, when you can't find the true scientific reason for some phenomenon, that's when you might use the term miracle. Okay. The World Bank completely missed the importance of fertility decline and changing age structures in East Asia, which contributed upwards of 2 percentage points to the 6+ percentage points of sustained annual income growth. Now, in fairness, I should point out that there's nothing automatic about economic gains following from fertility decline. The same demographic shifts, these fertility declines, can also be a trigger for social and political instability. And I hope we all make sure that we don't forget Arab Spring or the recent mass protests and unrest in Sudan, Hong Kong, Iraq, Chile, Bolivia, and Iran. They all provide the world with searing reminders of the consequences of failing to deliver jobs and incomes to large numbers of adolescents and young adults on a widespread and inclusive basis. The point here is that a country's demography is fraught with both opportunities and risks. The good news is that policymakers generally have myriad options for interventions aimed at shaping the demographics and also managing their translation into economic, social, and political outcomes and making sure that they're the ones we desire to have. So just by way of brief example here, when it comes to creating and capturing a demographic dividend, we can think of policies that are suitably geared to countries at different phases of the demographic cycle. For populations that have high mortality and fertility, in other words, pre-demographic transition, policies are appropriately oriented toward catalyzing a demographic transition. Such policies include, first, investments that promote infant and child survival, such as expanded vaccine coverage. Second, policies that expand the reach of well-provisioned and appropriately staffed primary healthcare systems. Along with three, policies that improve access to safe water and sanitation, as well as to antibiotics when appropriate. For populations that have experienced health and survival gains, in other words, populations that are midway through the demographic transition, policies may be needed to enable fertility declines, such as, and especially, promoting girls' education and access to reproductive health and family planning supplies and services. And finally, for populations that are at the tail end or post-demographic transition, where there are relatively sizable shares of the population concentrated in the high work and high savings portions of the life cycle, policies may be needed to realize the potential benefits of favorable demographics. Such policies include those that support the operation of competitive labor and capital markets, laying down infrastructure, sound macroeconomic management, carefully designed trade policies, and perhaps above all, good governance. Such policies, I would say, are always desirable, but a large working age population share raises the stakes. Let me now turn to the fourth and final indicator of our global demographic upheaval, the graying of global population. Now, as mentioned at the outset, I'm an economist. I don't know if it was mentioned because I couldn't tell in the Portuguese, but I'm also a demographer. And as a demographer, I'm routinely surveyed about the most important population issues facing the world. For decades, rapid population growth topped the list. But that's no longer the case. population aging has now displaced rapid population growth as the #1 population issue of concern among professional demographers worldwide. Let me start by reviewing some numbers to get us all on the same page. To begin with, before we can get to the numbers, we actually need a definition of old age. And I'll share with you a popular one, and one that I can tell you in advance I've become increasingly fond of as I get ready to celebrate my 65th birthday later this year. Thank you. Sadly, and with apologies to some of you in the audience, I'm going to proceed by sticking with a more conventional definition, that being the definition used by academic demographers, which holds that the 65 and over crowd constitutes the old. Yes, I understand that it flies in the face of popular notions, like the one that tells us that 75 is the new 65. And I understand that it fails to recognize the complex and fluid relationship between chronological age and functional age, a relationship that may operate differently in different household and community contexts. And by the way, as some of you may have heard, a bullet was dodged a couple of years ago regarding the complexity of this relationship between chronological and functional age. It was dodged in the Netherlands when a Dutch court rejected a request from a man to revise his date of birth because, as he said, he felt more like 49 than 69. Anyway, I'll stick with the 65 and over definition based on one's date of birth at the time of birth. It has the virtues of simplicity, plausibility, and comparability, and I think it's a good place for us to certainly begin. And it also allows us to relatively quantify the magnitude of the challenge. Now, with regard to this challenge, the phenomenon of population age, as we heard during the panel, is without precedent. Never before in history have such large numbers of people reached ages 65 and over. As I mentioned earlier, it took more than 99% of human history for humanity to reach a total population of 1 billion. And now we expect to add 1 billion older individuals in the next 3 to 4 decades. And that's atop the 700 million older people we already have today. 3 decades ago, the world was populated by over 3 times as many adolescents and young adults as older people. 3 decades from now, those age groups will be roughly on par. I would also note here that with one possible exception, every country in the world is experiencing population aging in the sense that its share of older people is increasing. The one possible exception is the Vatican, and that's only because the Holy See doesn't publicize data on age composition. Among the older population, the group aged 85 and over, that we demographers call the oldest old, is growing especially fast, and it's projected to surpass 500 million before the end of this century. This trend is significant because, as I'm sure everyone understands, the needs and capacities of the 85 and over crowd tend to differ significantly from those aged 65 to 84. Now, in terms of population share, the older adult population share, Japan is currently the world leader with 28% of its population aged 65 and over. That's triple the world average and more than 20 times the share in the United Arab Emirates, which anchors the bottom of the country list. But by 2050, there will literally be dozens of countries in the world that have larger elder shares than Japan has today. Economists have expressed great concerns about population aging. Their concerns relate, importantly, to downward pressure on economic growth due to the fact that older people don't work and save as much as their younger adult counterparts. This signals labor and capital shortages and falling asset prices as older people seek to support themselves by liquidating their assets. Another major issue has to do with fiscal stress due to rising pension liabilities and rising costs of health and long-term care associated with the likely growth in the incidence and prevalence of chronic diseases like cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, dementia, respiratory disease, and so forth. They already account for the lion's share of global deaths, and those numbers are just simply going to rise on a going-forward basis. These concerns are being whipped up by popular commentators into a frenzy of concern about the economic catastrophes that supposedly await us. My favorite old age agitator here is Pete Peterson, former U.S. Secretary of Commerce and former chairman of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. Over 20 years ago, in a Foreign Affairs article, he went so far as to describe global aging as a threat more grave and certain than those posed by chemical weapons, nuclear proliferation, or ethnic strife. I wonder if North Korea's Kim Jong-un actually knows that. As I'll explain in a few moments, I'm not as pessimistic as Pete was, but I certainly don't think we can or should dismiss his concerns as alarmist banter. One big problem here is that we absolutely don't have any historic examples that we can turn to for good indications of the implications of population aging and for how to address those challenges and take advantages of opportunities they may offer. A second problem is that we're very dismissive of the economic contributions of older people simply on the grounds that they are relatively unengaged. Older people are relatively unengaged in productive market activities. Our failing here is that we're completely neglecting the value of older people's productive non-market activities. For example, the value of volunteer work, the value of caregiving for spouses and for grandchildren, and the value of work they do around the house. These activities tend to increase when individuals retire, and they appreciably diminish the burden of population aging. And that's in addition to the value they create by promoting familial and intergenerational connectivity. But I would say that the biggest question mark we have here that goes with population aging has to do whether we're just adding years to life or also adding life to years. The answer to this question has to do with whether our future is going to look like this or whether it will look more like this. With respect to this image, what if it's the case that by extending longevity, we're merely postponing death, but not the onset of chronic disease, not the functional breakdown of our minds and bodies, and not the loss of our personal independence? In that circumstance, all we get from an increase in the lifespan is more years of severe frailty, mass loneliness, and extreme isolation in old age facilities that are overrun by octogenarians and centenarians. All we get is more misery as we spend more years unable to handle unassisted, normal activities of daily living, such as eating, bathing, dressing, grooming, and going to the toilet. And all the state gets are bigger and more persistent health care and pension liabilities without offsetting tax receipts. By contrast, and with respect to this more appealing image, suppose that not only death is postponed, but also the onset of morbidity associated with chronic disease. And suppose further that some combination of public health interventions, pharmaceuticals, and medical treatments slow the progression of chronic disease, and that the local environment and infrastructure become more friendly to older persons. Then we get a real increase in human well-being as a result of the increased lifespan, with much more modest fiscal implications for the state. This latter phenomenon has a name. It's known as the compression of morbidity, the idea that the morbid years are compressed into a smaller part of the life cycle, either absolutely or relatively. The evidence base is somewhat thin in this domain, and different bits of evidence point in different directions. But until we resolve this uncertainty, we won't know whether the greater longevity that's helping drive population aging is the blessing it seems or has some elements of a curse in disguise. Now, in a few minutes, I'm going to share some thoughts about how we might naturally and best address the challenges of population aging. But first, I'd like to spend a little bit of time commenting on the health and demographic situation here in Portugal. And here I'd offer 4 key observations, and I'm going to go through these quickly, and I think I can, since some of this is a review of what's already been covered. The first observation is that Portugal's total population, and also its working age population, are already past their peak. This chart shows Portugal's total population from 1950 through today and projected out to the year 2050. The total population is the height of the blue, the red, and the green bands. Please note that Portugal's total population maxed out just over a decade ago, in 2009, and coincidentally, that's the same year as the foundation was launched. The working age population, which I define to be those aged 20 to 64, and represented by the red band in the middle, it also reached its absolute peak around that time. In addition, the ratio of the working age to the dependent population is also past its peak, which means that Portugal's dependency burden is rising and its demographic dividend is now a thing of the past. This chart shows that there are currently about 1.4 working-age adults for every child and elderly dependent in Portugal. That 1.4 will be lower than even in the poorest countries of the world in recent history, though in those countries, and I'm thinking here mostly about Sub-Saharan Africa in recent decades, in those countries, the low ratio of the working age to the dependent population was mainly because of high fertility and high youth dependency, whereas in Portugal, it's due predominantly to old age dependency. This diagram basically indicates that Portugal is facing a steep descent over a demographic cliff. Actually, Portugal is already starting to tumble over the cliff, and the tumbling is going to continue for some time. And I can tell you that as someone who has an extreme fear of heights, that makes me feel rather insecure about Portugal's economic future. My second observation takes a deeper dive into population aging, which is a dominant feature, obviously, of Portugal's future demography. So this chart that you see here shows the shares of Portugal's 65 and over and 85 and over populations in brown and blue, respectively. The number of people 65 and over is currently 2.3 million, and it's projected to rise to 3.2 million by 2050, at which point it will constitute over 1/3, 35% of Portugal's total population. I would note here that 3.2 million is larger than the current population of the Lisbon metropolitan area. And of those 3.2 million older individuals, 660,000 will be age 85 and over, constituting about 7% of Portugal's total population. Okay, and that's roughly double the current population share of the so-called oldest old. Population aging in Portugal is very rapid by international standards. As I said earlier, between now and 2050, every country in the world is projected to grow older, but some will grow older faster than others. And you should know that the dramatic pace of population aging in Portugal places it very much toward the upper end of the spectrum. This graph here shows how the median age has changed over time, the median age being the age that half of the population is older than and half is younger than. The world median age, which is the blue line there, has increased from a low point of 22 in 1970 to about 31 today. By 2050, the median age of the world is projected to be about 36. By contrast, Portugal already has a median age of 46, and it's in the midst of breaking away from Europe with respect to the aging trajectory. By 2050, Portugal's median age is projected to reach 52, which is roughly 4 years older than Japan's median age now. And as we know, Japan has the oldest population in the world. And this fact should give us all pause, given that Japan is already struggling mightily with the economic implications of its aging population. As an aside, a very brief aside, I would note that longevity gains in the world have caused the introduction of a new age category. So we've heard about octogenarians, nonagenarians, centenarians. Well, now we have supercentenarians. That's people aged 110 and over. Portugal has seen roughly a dozen of its citizens reach the supercentenarian mark so far this century. Although the precise number is a little hard to pin down, as some longevity claims prove difficult to verify. Nevertheless, the longest-lived Portuguese person ever documented was this woman, Maria de Jesus. She died in 2009 at the age of 115 years and 114 days. Before her death, Maria was the oldest living person in the world. While she never purportedly smoked, drank alcohol, or ate meat, except for fish, she did report having lifelong difficulty resisting rice pudding and ice cream. My third key observation is that changes in the size, growth, and age structure of Portugal's population mainly reflect the interplay of increases in life expectancy and a sustained downward trend to extremely low fertility. And migration is also a factor that I'd like to comment on briefly. With respect to trends in mortality, life expectancy at birth in Portugal was 60 in 1950. It increased an average of 3 years per decade since then, and it's currently 82, which puts Portugal in league with its peers in the EU and is nearly a decade above the world average. By 2050, the figure is projected by the UN Population Division, the life expectancy figure for Portugal is projected to reach about 86. On the fertility side, Portuguese women on average had over 3 children during the course of their lifetimes in 1950. That figure has plummeted to 1.3 today. That fact is driving the declining growth rate of population here and also the increasing elder share, both absolutely and in relation to the rest of Europe. The UN actually predicts a gradual rebound in the upcoming decades, but Portuguese fertility is still expected to be below average among both European and high-income countries. Now let me turn to migration, which has also had a non-trivial influence on Portugal's population and age structure. The number of immigrants living in Portugal is now close to 900,000, almost 9% of the population. Migration patterns are important here because they affect the share of the population that's elderly insofar as a disproportionately large share of migrants are of working age. When migrants leave the country, the elderly share rises, and when they come to Portugal, the elder share tends to fall. And that's not even commenting on the brain drain issues that were mentioned earlier. Emigration out of Portugal outweighed immigration into the country for most of the last decade, likely as a result of Portugal's precarious economic situation for much of that period. However, emigration has recently started to abate, while immigration has increased. And in 2017, that's the most recent year for which I've been able to access data, the net migration rate was positive for the first time in several years, albeit modestly. For a slightly different way to view many of these changes in Portugal's demography, we can look at some population pyramids. Population pyramids like this show the share of population in each age group, with age groups represented by horizontal slices. Males are shown on the left side in blue and females on the right side in red. And please note that I've put a box at the top of this diagram that's meant to draw your attention towards the population age 65 and over. This first pyramid you see here is for 1950. As you can see, in 1950, Portugal had a very young population. Children dominated adults, adults dominated the elderly, at least in terms of numbers. And that pattern is what gives Portugal's 1950 age distribution its pyramidal shape. And I'm going to move forward in time now, as we'll see when we move forward in time, and beyond 1990 in particular, you'll notice that the base of the pyramid gets relatively smaller as fertility declines. So let's go to 1960, 1970, 1980. Okay, now pay attention because it's going to start to change a little bit more. 1990 with the decline in fertility and the narrowing of the base of the pyramid. 2000, 2010, and now let's look at what things look like today, 2020. You see that Portugal's population pyramid is no longer pyramid-shaped. It looks a little heavy around the middle, and a lot more like Brazil's Ronaldo than Portugal's Ronaldo. Let me continue. 2030, 2040, and then I'll take it to 2050. And what you see here is that the share of older people in Portugal has visibly increased, starting in 1950 and taking us up, projected out to 2050. Also, I don't know if anyone was able to keep up with the statistics in the upper right corner on these slides, but if you did, you would have noticed that the elder share of Portugal's population rose from 7% in 1950 to 23% today, and it's projected to rise further to 35% by the year 2050. Now, the very last factual observation I'd like to make about Portugal has to do with the health situation. It relates to what I like to call the fundamental theorem of epidemiology. This theorem tells us that we all die once. The interesting question is not therefore whether we die, but when, why, and under what circumstances. In this connection, Portugal already has a large burden of non-communicable diseases, known as NCDs, which are represented in various shades of blue on this chart. Currently, 89% of all deaths in Portugal are due to non-communicable diseases. That's well above the 73% global average. And I can tell you as an economist that this pattern is consequential. It's consequential because the cost of NCDs is so substantial, because treatment and care costs are relatively expensive, and also because NCDs undermine labor's contribution to output by causing disability and death and also the loss of physical and human capital. In fact, based on a macroeconomic model that my colleagues and I recently calibrated for Portugal, the value of lost market productivity due to morbidity and mortality from NCDs is equivalent to a roughly 2% tax on GDP over the 2015 to 2030 period. And that, I should mention also, is inclusive of the contractionary effect of Portugal having to divert a portion of savings to cover the cost of treatment for non-communicable diseases. Consumption of tobacco, alcohol, and caloric sugar-laden drinks, as well as physical inactivity, are key modifiable risk factors for NCDs. Portugal actually scores well in some, but not in all of these dimensions. Now, for example, smoking rates are declining for men, and they remain relatively low among women, and alcohol use appears to be under control by international standards. And notwithstanding, I would say, all the delicious wines, ports, and ginja, if I pronounced that correctly. On the other hand, the prevalence of obesity in Portugal is increasing, and population aging is, as we've discussed, continuing apace, which will tend to drive up the incidence, the prevalence, and the economic burden of NCDs, since age is a risk factor for NCDs, and sadly, not a modifiable one. So we've now discussed demographic change, both globally and also here in Portugal, and we've also discussed the economic significance of both past and prospective changes. What I'd like to do now is to run through several categories of public and private adaptations and adjustments to respond to the challenges posed by demographic change, with a particular emphasis on population aging, since I know that's what is foremost in your minds. Among the kinds of adaptations and adjustments we might expect to see or to undertake are the following. We have behavior changes, policy reforms, changes in business policy and practices, and technological and institutional innovations. Let me quickly run through some of the particulars. And I offer this to you as kind of a checklist for things that you might think about, undertake, or at least just consider in terms of addressing the challenge of population aging. With respect to behavior and change in behavior, the low fertility that contributes to population aging has led to and will continue to lead to relatively high labor force participation by women. That will give some relief to the tightening of the workforce that's naturally expected to accompany population aging. Fewer children also tend to mean healthier, smarter, and better educated children. And insofar as gains in health, cognition, and education translate into higher adult productivity, lower fertility is tantamount to an increase in the effective labor force. This will offset the negative effect of population aging on shrinking workforce numbers, and non-trivially so, according to a number of recent analyses. Just to put it a slightly different way, the simple idea here is that a well-educated, well-trained, and healthy worker is equivalent to 1.x times their less educated, less well-trained, and less healthy counterpart. And that 1.x will likely be further magnified by the proliferation of robots, although that's a topic for another day. I'd also mention that when people expect to live longer, they have an incentive to save more for the years after they're no longer working, which in cross-national data translates into appreciably higher savings and also higher investment rates. Let me turn now from behavior to policy and just note very quickly that it's natural for people to respond to longer lifespans and hopefully longer healthy lifespans by planning on longer working lives. Unfortunately, public policy throughout the world has been extremely sluggish in adapting to the new demographic realities, as most of the world's social security systems create strong incentives for retirement between the ages of 55 and 65. For an example, an analysis of public pension systems in several dozen upper income and upper middle income countries reveals that male life expectancy rose an average of 12 years between 1965 and 2016, but the mean legal retirement age basically did not change at all. It increased perhaps by a year. Allowing people more freedom of choice regarding the timing of retirement would, I think, be a very good starting point for policy reform aimed at buttressing the supply of labor. According to my rough calculations, increasing pension-eligible ages by 5 years could effectively push the clock back by at least 15 years in terms of the tightening of the workforce that comes with population aging. On the other hand, while raising the retirement age might promote higher market income and tax contributions, these benefits will dig into non-market contributions, which compete for the same endowment of time, and which I argued earlier are also an important component of the economic contribution of older people. In fact, based on calculations my colleagues and I have made, the value of non-market contributions by older adults in Portugal far outweighs the value of their non-market contributions, of their market contributions. There is, of course, an equity issue here. It arises in connection with increases in the legal age of retirement, and the issue has to do with the fact that increases in life expectancy have been enjoyed predominantly by those who are better off, in other words, more educated and more well-to-do. And I would say there's a legitimate question as to why blue-collar workers should have to wait longer to retire because accountants, lawyers, physicians, and executives are living longer. International migration policies have further potential to ameliorate the economic effects of population aging, insofar as youthful poor country populations fill job vacancies in the aging countries. A key observation here has to do with the different but highly complementary age structures of developed and developing regions. From this observation, the suggestion follows that migration might serve the purposes of both sets of regions. This is an idea that's often referred to as replacement migration. It's a successor of sorts to the concept of replacement fertility that's commonly bandied about in the popular press. Essentially, the idea is that Europe, which has a high percentage of elderly people and few children, needs workers, which Sub-Saharan Africa could readily supply. This graph shows the ratio of working age to non-working age people in Europe and Sub-Saharan Africa separately, the blue and the red lines, as well as the ratio for the two regions added together. That would be the green line in the middle. Please notice that the time path of the working age ratio for the two regions taken together, in other words, the green line, is much more moderate and steadier than either the red line for Europe or the blue line for Sub-Saharan Africa. Notwithstanding the theoretical soundness of the idea of replacement migration, I've calculated that it would take more than a tenfold increase in the current level of migration from Sub-Saharan Africa to Europe to achieve this smoothing, and that tenfold increase would need to go on for 25 years. To my mind, that's hardly realistic, especially given the social and political tensions that even current rates of African migration to Europe raise. The Swiss writer Max Frisch captured quite succinctly the divide between theory and practice when it comes to replacement migration. He was assessing Europe's experience with guest worker programs in the 1960s, and he famously wrote, "We wanted workers, but we got people instead." The point here is that international migration is unlikely to be a big contributor to relieving the pressure of population aging in most countries, but it can be counted on for something, at least around the edges, and it may be quite important in some countries that are more comfortable or figure out how to get more comfortable with migration. Another policy option here has to do with reforming the health system. I'm thinking here about increasing the emphasis we place on disease prevention and early detection as opposed to treatment and care. Please, let's all recall the old adage that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And when I say prevention, I'm talking about everything from encouraging and incentivizing better diets and more physical activity to expanding coverage of adult vaccines, such as those against pneumococcal disease, herpes zoster, and seasonal influenza. Policymakers also need to understand and act on the observation that early detection of disease is hugely cost-saving. When diseases are caught early, they're usually easier and less expensive to treat and more satisfactorily and permanently resolved. This lowers direct health costs and enables people to work longer and more productively, which gives a boost to their income and also to governmental tax receipts. And please keep in mind that many of the policies that we're talking about here are strongly complementary in nature. For example, raising the retirement age will be more effective in maintaining the size and productivity of the workforce if people are healthy, thanks, for example, to good nutrition, more physical activity, and full immunization. On the private policy side, there are also a multiplicity of actions that businesses can take to respond to population aging. These actions could, for example, involve, as we've heard, changes in human resource practices aimed at reducing the impediments to work participation among older individuals, retraining, reassignment to jobs that are better aligned with their interests and capacities, changes in the physical work environment, remote work, flexible work schedules. The range of options here also includes focusing on, for businesses to focus on, not just governments, prevention and early detection of costly-to-treat NCDs by establishing on-site health clinics and worker wellness programs, by contracting with mobile health services, and by incentivizing behaviors like physical activity or cessation of smoking. And finally, we have technological and institutional innovations as another category of responses to ameliorate the effects of population aging. I'm thinking here on the technology side of the emerging field of longevity science, which is focused on developing drugs to slow the progress of aging and augment healthy life years. I'm also referring to the development of new vaccines, such as a universal flu vaccine, vaccines for common hospital-acquired infections like C. difficile, and also a vaccine for the pathogen formerly known as the Wuhan coronavirus, and yesterday renamed as COVID-19. I'm referring, in addition to personalized and precision medicine, fueled by advances in molecular and genetic testing. This offers tremendous new possibilities for individualized prediction and treatment of disease. And I think we should also think very seriously about the advent of digital health, ranging from telemedicine to wearable sensors to electronic medical records and new methods for transmitting health information and recommendations. These all create exciting new opportunities for higher quality healthcare at lower cost. And finally here, in terms of technological innovation, I would be remiss if I didn't also mention the promise of new assistive devices. Think here of the rapid evolution of robots in Japan. Japan's first generation robots quietly did tasks like vacuuming the floor. The second generation robots did those same tasks and expressed emotions, like saying, "You look nice today." Okay, and Japan's third generation robots have been programmed to be even more human-like. So when you instruct your robot to vacuum, it might respond in good teenage fashion by saying, "I don't feel like doing it right now." And I would imagine that robotic fist bumps are not that far off in our future. Let me now take just a final minute or two to bring my remarks to closure. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the expression, demography is destiny. It means that the social, political, and economic fabric of a nation is fundamentally determined by the size, the growth, and the structure of its population. This phrase is thought, demography is destiny, is thought to have been coined by Auguste Comte, the gentleman you see here, a French philosopher who lived in the 19th century and founded the field of sociology. Now, I hope that after the better part of the hour we spent together, that none of you walk out of this session thinking that I'm a follower of Monsieur Comte. On the contrary, I strongly contest the view that demography is destiny. Demographic trajectories are not set in stone, please remember that, okay? And please also remember that nor are demographic implications set in stone with respect to economic growth and development. History shows, and common sense and economic reasoning confirm, that demographic change has a persistent habit of spurring behavioral changes as well as policy reforms, technological innovations, and institutional innovations that either accentuate favorable demographics or can offset negative ones. This is what ensued when world population was doubling from 3 to 6 billion from 1960 to 2000. Lots of dire predictions were made in the 1960s, and they garnered a great deal of attention. And I'm not arguing that there were no adverse consequences stemming from that period of rapid population growth. But the reality is that many of the most distressing prognoses that were made were not borne out. Global income per capita more than doubled between 1960 and 2000. Life expectancy increased by more than 15 years, and primary school enrollment rates approached universality in many countries. As long as we don't sit in our hands and fail to respond behaviorally, technologically, and institutionally to the new demographic normal, I do predict that we'll have similar success when it comes to benefiting from the opportunities and coping with the challenges posed by demographic change. The key here is to plan in advance, to learn from each other, not to get in the way of natural adaptations, and not to fail to lead the way when markets aren't enough. If we can do that, I think we'll be a good bet to deliver a second major counterexample to Monsieur Comte's catchy, but I think rather exaggerated line. Well, you've been a terrific audience, absolutely terrific. In case anyone has questions or comments, please feel free to email them to me. I'll do my best to send you a prompt response. As my wife knows, she's sitting here in the front row, I try to clear my email before I go to bed every night. She hates that, but that's just the way it is, so I'll try to do the same if you email me. I'll just say to you all, obrigado, obrigado, obrigado. Thank you.